Greetings, YTPC. It's Peter Piper, the True Light, coming to you at 1500 hours and 50 minutes Eastern Standard Time, minus 4 or 5 hours Greenwich Mean Time, depending on which clock you're following. I find it confusing. Anyway, let me get the housekeeping out of the way. I'm smoking my new Savinelli 626 bent apple, and in it I'm smoking some Newminster number 400 Superior Navy Flake. I just got a delivery from the Pipe Nook, our good friend, what's his name? I forget. Anyway, I got some White Elephant charcoal filters. Not used to smoking a filter pipe. Kind of a heavier draw. And I also bought 2 new tobaccos from GLPs. I got Sixpence, and I got, let's see here, Speak Easy. I think that's GLPs. I'm running the specs on so I can't tell. Anyway, this is the bookend to my VR to Redcoat Returns, or as it stands now, Redcoat's Renaissance. He got hit pretty bad during a chat session with Kilted Piper and his wife, I think, and somebody hacked into his account, so he had to change the name, and it's unfortunate, and well, kind of the Wild West of the digital frontier. At any rate, I gotta get relit here. Pardon me. So I have to give credit to the YTPC that I would say much more than, or much less than the 99% I predicted would not know the identity of my avatar. We have an educated community. If you know who J. Robert Oppenheimer is, then you've done some reading, or you've obviously done some, I don't know, perusing of, you got a little bit of geek blood in you, I guess, is what I could say. Anyway, here's a better picture of him in his younger day. Julius Robert Oppenheimer, and I had some notes here on what happened to him. His nickname, I guess, among his friends and close associates was Oppie, and he was born on the 22nd of this month, that being April, in 1904. He was born to a pretty wealthy or well-to-do Jewish family in New York City. It's where they lived in the beginning. And being that as it may, he was educated at Harvard University. And even while he was growing up, he was noted to be very gifted. And I would say he had a rather superior IQ. If not in the Mensa end of the spectrum, certainly several standard deviations forward of 100. And he also was educated at Christ College in Cambridge, England. He was educated by many of the famous physicists in the early part of the 20th century. And this was when what we call modern physics, was in its heyday and just coming into fruition with Einstein's theory of relativity, which totally blew away Newtonian physics at the time. It just made the universe a much more complex entity. And he was associated with J.J. Thomson, who discovered the electron, also Max Born, and Heisenberg, author of the famous Heisenberg uncertainty principle. Wolfgang Pauli, Paul Dirac, and Enrico Fermi. These are all names that these were the major league ball players in the modern physics and quantum mechanics field back during the first half of the 20th century. He later, after gaining his PhD, took a job as a physics instructor in theoretical physics at Berkeley, California, and was contemporary with the experimental physics professor Ernest Lawrence, who the Lawrence Livermore laboratories are named after. And Ernest Lawrence, being an experimental physicist, developed one of the early particle accelerators at Berkeley called the cyclotron. And with that piece of machinery, they were able to separate uranium-235 and 238, I believe, if I've gotten my numbers correct. Anyway, this was in the mid to late 30s, and during that time, Nazi Germany was things were starting to heat up anyway in Europe under Hitler. And Oppenheimer, of course, being a Jew, that kind of played into the story a little bit later. But it's a really complicated story. At any rate, Oppenheimer was definitely a liberal, politically liberal person. And back then, if you were a liberal in the 30s, you were, if you weren't a communist, you certainly had some association, perhaps, with the Communist Party. And he was sympathetic to the communist movement, certainly from the perspective of a social justice type of position. Labor movements, you know, certainly there was racism that played a part in that. And personally, being conservative, I wouldn't probably necessarily buy into a lot of Oppie's not theology, what's the word I'm looking for? Ideology, I guess. But I think that it's important to have diversity of thought and to find, you know, like in an overlap or a common ground with someone. And certainly in the scientific realm, that was possible. And he was a very open-minded person. He understood the need for security in this field. But I'm getting ahead of myself now. Pardon me. I'm having a drink. Even though it's early, I got out of my last meeting recently, and it helps reduce stress a bit. And yes, I'm off work. Let me get relit. Sure is different with a filter. So, as America, when it became apparent that America was eventually going to enter the war, I think Oppenheimer saw the writing on the wall and thought that his work and the work of E.O. Lawrence would be important, an important thing to. In other words, they knew that building a nuclear weapon or an atomic weapon was certainly possible, based on research that was done in Germany under Heisenberg. And Heisenberg was basically Hitler's Einstein. Since Einstein emigrated to the United States in the 30s, and Hitler had already decided that relativity was a Jewish theory, Heisenberg himself was Jewish, but for some reason he got a pass, I guess. I think his brain had a lot to do with it. So, the United States decided, after Einstein had written a letter to President Roosevelt, that the United States should engage in development of an atomic bomb. the U.S. Industrial, um, and I guess this is an early example of what Eisenhower later called uh, the U.S. Uh, Defense Industrial Complex, something like that. Just trying to get my pipe going. Defense Industrial Complex, something like that. Anyway, this is an early example of that. So, a general by the name of Leslie Groves, actually at the time he was a colonel, and upon taking the job as the military leader of what later became known as the Manhattan Project, Leslie Groves was very much a bombastic, uh, arrogant, asshole, if you will. But you have to ask yourself, if you were to look at someone to do a job and he was sort of like Donald Trump, perhaps. Donald Trump is very much probably could be compared to Leslie Groves as being a bombastic, arrogant asshole. But you have to ask yourself, if you need somebody to do a job, who are you going to hire? Are you going to hire someone you like? Are you going to hire a friend? Or are you going to hire someone who can get the job done? And I think that's why Leslie Groves was appointed as basically the military head of the Manhattan Project. And J. Robert Oppenheimer was the civilian head of the Manhattan Project. And whereas Groves basically had an administrative role over the project, Oppenheimer had the brains over the project. And he led to the development of the atomic bomb in very, what would be considered a warp speed type of program of development. The Manhattan Project is the gold standard for doing anything, I think, in the way of development of something rapidly that we need now, very shortly. We need this very quickly. And you have to understand that they were working against time. They were sure that the Germans under Heisenberg would develop the atomic bomb before we did. And if they did, I think things would be, the world would be in a much different place. But when they finally invaded and overthrew Germany in 1945, they found out that the Germans were actually much further behind us. But at the time, we hadn't even exploded our first test weapon yet. That came later in August of 1945. And I'm going to harken back a little bit to Oppenheimer being Jewish, and probably a lot of the fever with which he pursued the development of the atomic bomb was that it would probably be used against Germany. And that wasn't the case, of course, because the development hadn't proceeded to the level where they could do that. And I'm not sure why, because we already knew that we had a fissionable weapon with Little Boy, which was the uranium weapon. And we didn't even test that. We just dropped it on Hiroshima because we knew it would work. So I'm going to try to wrap this up quickly. I know I've been going on for quite a while now. We're over 20 minutes. But after we had the Trinity test in August 1945, very quickly after that, we dropped it on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And I think that Oppenheimer, on a personal level, was horrified by the results that the bomb produced and the casualties that it inflicted, horrific casualties. And it led to the formation of, I think, the Union of Concerned Scientists, or some organization like that that was against the development of the hydrogen bomb, which came several years later, which is a much more destructive and powerful weapon. And one of Oppenheimer's contemporaries, Edward Teller, was very much a proponent of that. He was a Hungarian Jewish physicist, very talented man. He later served on President Ronald Reagan's Science Advisory Board, and promoted the idea of the Strategic Defense Initiative, or what was more commonly known as Star Wars, in the 1980s. But Oppenheimer, with his League of Concerned Scientists, opposed the development of the hydrogen bomb, and he was more interested in developing a treatise with Russia, who, through espionage, which also worked into the mix, and just made things really complicated for Oppenheimer in particular, given his communist-associated background. He just got the system turned against him. And this is an example of how things can go politically for you if you go against the tide, if you try to swim upstream, if you try to sail into a headwind against the force of a very powerful agenda. So, long story short, the government and the military knew that they needed Oppenheimer back during the Manhattan Project. They needed his brains, they needed his leadership, which which I think was a challenge for him in the beginning, because he was certainly a great teacher. But he did exemplify a great deal of leadership during the Manhattan Project. And the military and the government knew that they needed this guy. Okay? But once he went against the system, and once he started campaigning against the development of the H bomb, the military and the government had their man. They had Edward Teller, and Teller, it was like Oppie was kind of cast off to the side at that point. They didn't really need him. He would have been useful, and they tried to bring him on board and tried to get him to buy into the philosophy and the program, but he didn't. He wouldn't have it. He was a very strong-willed individual, and it eventually ruined him. The government going against the government led to basically a campaign of the government against him. And long story short, they revoked his security clearance. Something that they gave him in the beginning, knowing everything they knew about his communist affiliations and associations in the beginning. They were able to successfully, and if the government wants to yank your clearance, they can do it. And it's all you got to do is raise the flag of national security and say you're a threat against national security, therefore you aren't entitled to a security clearance. So that's what happened. He later became, after that, he later went to Princeton University, and I think by this time Albert Einstein had passed away, and Oppenheimer became the head of the University of Advanced Studies at Princeton University in New Jersey, and which is a good position to have. But I think that he probably felt ruined by the government, or by the government. He kind of felt defeated, even though he had that prestigious position. He contracted throat cancer in the late 60s and died on the 18th of February 1967 at the age of 62. Now, he was a chain smoker. He smoked cigarettes continuously, and he also smoked a pipe, and he did enjoy pipe smoking, but he also smoked, he was a very heavy smoker. And not to mention the fact that he probably had a pretty good exposure to some intense ionizing electromagnetic radiation throughout all the testing. And there are stories upon stories of incidences that happened at Los Alamos where people died from radiation exposure. And I could go on, but there's this story called the Third Core, or the Demon Third Core of the third atomic bomb. And nasty stuff. I may talk about that in another video. But anyway, I was always fascinated by Oppenheimer's life and legacy. And I'm going to put a link in the bucket below with a BBC series that played during the 1980s. And it was a, pardon me. It was a docudrama Oppenheimer. And it was one of the inspirations that got me interested in engineering. One of the inspirations. And it had a pretty heavy effect on me when I watched it. At the time, I was on strike in the machinists union, and I always wanted to work in electronics. And I, basically just dabbled in it in my machinist career at the time. And just seeing people at a blackboard hammering out equations and trying to figure stuff out just fascinated me. And if you watch the first 7 minutes of the first episode of the series, that's one of the moments that really inspired me, where Oppenheimer is teaching in a classroom and he's hammering out equations on the blackboard, and he says, "So what's the answer to this equation?" And he goes over